Hi there. We're going to continue our little phenomenology course now. This is our fourth lecture. The last three lectures were on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. This time we're going to begin Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, published in 1807. When we did the Kant, I tried to develop, the phenomenological dimensions of Kant's study, but I also wanted to take you over a path that would kind of give you the arc of Kant's work as a whole. So I tried to give you sort of a complete story of Kant. I didn't tell you everything there is to say about Kant, but I gave you kind of a vision of the whole story of human experience as he analyzes it. We're not going to do that with Hegel. We could. It would take a few more lectures. But that's not my purpose here, so we're going to get a part of it. And I mention that just because I want you to remember that there are other things to say, other things to know about. In any case, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the theme of self-consciousness in Hegel. We're going to look in particular at this chapter from the Phenomenology of Spirit that's called Chapter 4, The Truth of Self-Certainty. Hegel has two different tables of contents, basically, two different organizing systems in the table of contents, and they don't seem perfectly consistent. People have written about that. But so this is both Chapter 4, The Truth of Self-Certainty, and Section B, Self-Consciousness. At some point, I may have reason to talk a little bit about that. But for the moment, I'll just mention that that's what we're going to do. And why are we doing this? Well, A, because we want to study Hegel as a phenomenologist, and this is a hugely important bit of phenomenology, and I'll mention that in a minute. But before I say that, I want to give another reason for why we're doing this. Why are we doing this here now? We're doing it because it picks up pretty directly on where we ended with the Kant. With the Kant, we ended up with the sort of interpretation of the Third Antimony, and we were talking about freedom and what it is, what it would mean to experience something as a free cause in the context of the world of nature. So if you remember those themes there, they will be pretty directly relevant to the way we're going to begin here. Because Hegel's study is essentially a study of freedom. Now let me give a word on terminology before I get further on with that. We're going to be looking at, as I said, Chapter 4, Truth of Self-Certainty, and that has two sections, Part A and Part B. Part A is called the independence and dependence of self-consciousness. Part B is called the freedom of self-consciousness. So you should note, not all interpreters of Hegel have done this, but you should note that Hegel distinguishes between what he calls independence, which is correlated with dependence, and what he calls freedom. Now I'm going to use the word freedom pretty colloquially. The same way that when we were talking about Kant, I used the word reality pretty colloquially. Kant means something pretty specific by reality, and he associates it with a particular category. And makes sense. We could talk about that, but I wanted to use the word in a just an everyday English sort of way, because that communicates well the things I was trying to say, and I thought that would be helpful to anyone listening to this to get the point. Well, similarly here, there are a variety of things I'm going to talk about where I'm going to use the word freedom, because that's just the way we commonly talk about things in everyday English. But I want you to remember that Hegel has a kind of a technical meaning for freedom, which I imagine we will talk about at some point. And when the time comes for that, it'll be important to be clear on what the difference is between freedom and independence and so on. But I'm going to begin and spend most of my time just using the word freedom kind of colloquially. Anyway, so that's really what we're going to be looking at in this chapter from Hegel. We're going to be looking at the story of freedom, and thereby we will pick up pretty directly on where Kant left us when he started talking about what was involved in the experience of freedom and why an experience of freedom is compatible with an experience of natural necessity or natural causality. We're not going to be addressing exactly that theme, but you will see that we're sort of talking from a different angle. We're sort of talking about the same issue. In the context of the critique of pure reason, that issue came up as a kind of, for lack of a better word, logical point. How could an experience of freedom be compatible with our experience of natural necessity? And the answer is it can be, and here's how and why it can be. So this isn't exactly the right way to put it, but you could sort of say that it was a negative conclusion in the sense that it was trying to show that the experience of freedom is not ruled out by, it's not incompatible with the fact that we experience a world of nature that's governed by natural causality and so on. So Hegel is not here pursuing that negative point. He's not sort of answering a kind of skeptical challenge. Rather, he's pursuing a more positive point. We do have the experience of freedom, and he's going to give a sort of phenomenological account of that experience. And so he's really going to be looking more positively at what is actually involved when we have those experiences. So the point then I'm trying to get at is we are picking up pretty directly from where we left off with that Kant. But that from one angle, the angle of talking about, our knowledge of reality and so on in Kant, that from one angle we got to this point, and Kant's analysis of it is like, how do we think about the experience looking back on those issues? And that's not what we're doing now. Now that we've got it with Hegel, we're going to take that same experience and say, well, what can we say taking this up on its own terms? So that's just a little bit of orientation to help you see that we're kind of going step by step, to help you see how what we're going to talk about today connects pretty directly with the themes that we have been talking about in the last few weeks, even though the ways we're going to talk about these themes now will make no obvious or direct connection or reference to those things we said before. I mean, periodically I might throw in a reference if I can think of a way to help make the connection clearer. But really we're taking up the same thing now, but taking it up from a different angle. So freedom, a little bit more about that before I dig into the text and the issues. Freedom is probably the biggest thing that Hegel's philosophy is about. He talks about everything. He talks about planets, gravity, chemistry, all kinds of things. But the focus or the hub or whatever you'd call it of his philosophy is freedom. And in a way, what his philosophy is really about is accounting for freedom. It's a philosophy of freedom. His great book, The Science of Logic, which I have here in rather tattered condition, is logic in Hegel's, again, in a sort of a loose sense, we say the logic of this, the logic of that. That's kind of the way Hegel uses the word. His book is not a logic book in the sense of studying the rules of correct reasoning, modus ponens or whatever. It's rather a study of something like relationships, logical relationships. What kind of relationship do you see in this situation? What kind of relationship do you see in this situation? Are the terms by which this thing is structured compatible with the terms by which this thing is structured? So in the same way that people might talk about the logic of institutions, or the logic of a court system, or the logic of money, or something like that, right? They don't mean patterns of reasoning. They mean the ways, the system by which something works. So Hegel's logic is a study of the different kinds of systems there are, the different kinds of rational relationships there are. I don't even use the word rational. The different kinds of relationships there are, from the simplest to the richest. So, one kind of relationship is pushing and pulling. There's a certain logic which is pushing and pulling. The simple logic of pushing and pulling, though, won't explain some things. It won't explain how somebody in Mumbai my friend Jung, for example, can phone me on this thing, and I can hear his voice in my living room. if the only thing you had were relations of pushing and pulling, that couldn't happen. Similarly, if the only thing you understood were relations of pushing and pulling, you couldn't understand how that works. So the logic of chemical relations, for example, is already significantly more complex than the logic of pushing and pulling, which is a simple kind of mechanics, simple kind of physical relationship. The logic of chemistry is more sophisticated than that. Or again, let me give you a couple more examples because I want you to really get a sense of this. If you think about a story, the logic of a story, there's a kind of typically, there's a kind of an unfolding. Something has to be set up or inaugurated. It has to be developed, and that development both means that changes have to happen, but whatever that original thing that was set up it can't be lost. So the way things change has to still preserve that. So there's a kind of, for lack of a better word again, an unfolding or something like that. And typically that story will bring those unfolding, bring those changes or that unfolding to a point where a significant kind of tension develops. So you think, oh no, what's going to happen or whatever, where some kind of crisis comes up for the main character or whatever, and then there will be some kind of resolution to that, and that will allow the story to come to a close. Something roughly like that. Inauguration, development, or like change and preservation, tension, relief of tension or overcoming of tension, and conclusion or ending. Something like that is kind of the logic of a story, something like that. That again, just going back to pushing and pulling, is something quite a bit different there between that and the logic of pushing and pulling. There's also a different logic to that than a logic of something like, a simple rhythm. If someone's going boom cha boom boom cha boom cha boom boom cha boom cha boom boom cha, I can go on for 2 hours. And rhythm has its own logic. It makes a lot of sense, but the logic of that unfolding story is not that same kind of thing. There's a kind of repetitive punctuation to that rhythm, and that is how the rhythm makes sense. It's by holding on to that theme and repeating it that it makes sense. Whereas the unfolding of a story involves a great deal more transformation and difference and so on, and has a real arc. It goes from here to here. Of course, you can play variations on a rhythm, sure enough, and there would be interesting things to say about that. But it doesn't really go from here to there. And if some great drummer were playing a rhythm and varying it, and you got really excited about it, and it really did feel like it went from here to there, like kind of in a drum solo or something, a good drum solo, that wouldn't be exactly about rhythm. It would involve rhythm, but something would be being done with rhythm, and more or less someone would say you're telling a story with it. Right? There would be a kind of a narrative arc to it. So I say this just because I want you to start thinking about the way that the terms by which one kind of relationship makes sense are not automatically terms that will be sufficient for understanding how some other kind of relationship makes sense. Now, sometimes there might just be different relationships. These terms won't explain this relationship, and its terms won't explain this relationship, and that's fine. And they may have no meaningful relationship beyond that. They're simply different. Maybe that's the case. But other times that's not so. Other times, one kind of relationship is more sophisticated than the other. And that's the case where situation B draws on and relies on the relationships, the relationships that characterize situation A, but then goes on to do something more with it that can't be done in number A. So the drum solo that I just gave an example of is in a way something more logically sophisticated than the simple notion of rhythm. You can't have a drum solo without a rhythm. You couldn't have a good one anyway. But it's not just rhythm. It's rhythm deployed so as to tell a story. Not a story in the sense of once upon a time there was a guy and these things happen, but in the sense of having a kind of narrative arc. not a story that could automatically be translated into words, but one where, going back to what I said about the logic of the story before, you are introduced to something, you experience it being developed and transformed, you experience a kind of excitement that comes with a development of a certain sort of tension, and a kind of release, and a kind of resolution and conclusion. Uh, um, so I wanted to mention that there are some kinds of relationships are more sophisticated than others. So what does Hegel's logic do? Hegel starts with the most simple logical relationship you can imagine, and basically studies progressively more sophisticated relationships. And this is all in the service of, again, to use this word colloquially, as with Kant, is to study reality. And so reality is as sophisticated as it gets because it's reality. So if there were anything of a certain level of sophistication, if that were real, well, then that would already be part of reality. So you're not going to have anything real. You're not going to have anything that exists that could exceed the logic of reality, because if it's real and if it exists, then it's part of reality. So reality includes that. So that's what we're really trying to comprehend. We're trying to comprehend the logic of the real, not unlike what Kant did with his categories. Tried to say, what is it to be real? Well, that's what Hegel's trying to do in the science of logic. He's asking what it is to be real. But one of the things that's interesting about Hegel is, rather than giving you the table of a dozen categories that Kant does, which is itself, profound and powerful, Hegel does it in a kind of a dynamic way. So he says, if you were going to talk about reality, what's the first thing you'd have to say? Right, the thing you'd have to say such that if you didn't say that, there wouldn't even be reality. And I've actually already given you the answer. You'd say it has to be. So Hegel's logic starts with the simple meaning of being, which is to say it is there. There's an immediate presence. And so I use the word immediate because we're talking about that which most directly and basically is, not something built upon something else. Because if it were built upon something else, then that other something else would already be there and it'd be more basic. And you say that's where reality started. But no, we're starting with the simple fact of is. So that turns out to be. I'm not going to go through it in any detail, but just a quick introduction. That turns out to be the most basic sense of reality, just the simple sense of immediate presence. But it doesn't take too much reflection on the notion of immediate presence to recognize that that is not a sophisticated enough logic, the logic of immediate presence, to give you reality. We've already actually seen a lot of the reason for that in Kant, with the distinction between the mathematical and the dynamical categories. And that is because reality, the reality that we encounter certainly is immediately there, but it's also reality extends in space. It endures in time, which means it takes up, more than one moment. It's got more than one. It's here and here and here and here. It's got more than one place. It's got more than one time. So we need to be able to recognize it as one and the same throughout many differences. So yes, it's what's immediately present, but we're also going to have a way of talking about this as opposed to that. It's present here and it's present there, and here is not to be simply confused and conflated with there, and so on. So again, with not too much reflection, we can start seeing that we're going to have to be able to talk about how reality is, on the one hand, the one and only thing that there is, the real, the only one, or Hegel likes to call it the absolute, the ultimate thing, that in relationship to which everything else is relative. So it's single, it's the one and only. But also, reality takes the form of many reals. This real thing, this real thing, this real thing. I mean, I use the word thing. I'm not even talking about anything as sophisticated as a thing yet. I just mean there's realness here. There's real here. There's real there. There's real there. Just think about spatial and temporal expanse, and you get multiplicity. So in that sense, there are many ones. There's this one and that one and that one and that one, and every one of them is a being, an instance of reality, and every instance of reality is one among many. So reality is, on the one hand, the one and only is, but it's also many ises, each of which is just one among many. And reality is also the way that even though all those many little ises are there, reality remains one and the same throughout them. So I hope that quick little discussion gets you to recognize quickly that, just the immediate meaning of what is, you've got to recognize a little bit of logical complexity. More than just saying simple presence, you have to recognize basically that reality is characterized by singularity, particularity, and universality. It's the one and only thing that there is. It's also many ones, particular ones, and yet it remains one and the same thing throughout them. So that was a quick version of why just saying simple is or simple presence isn't enough. It's the first thing you have to say, but with a little reflection, you can see that there is more internal logical complexity to this. So Hegel's science of logic goes through that kind of thing in greater detail. Where it ends, and this is the point I wanted to get to, it ends basically with what kind of logic you'd have to comprehend freedom. And so, like Kant, Hegel distinguishes the mathematical and the dynamical categories. That's not his language. Hegel's language is categories of immediacy and categories of reflection. And those two things, his fuller study of those two things, of categories of immediacy and categories of reflection, or what he also calls them categories of being and categories of essence. But those two things, his study is of the mathematical and the dynamical categories, take up the first 2/3 of his science of logic. So he's got book 1 on the categories of immediacy. He also calls it the doctrine of being. Book 2 is on categories of reflection, or what he calls doctrine of essence. But he puts those 2 of the 3 parts of his book together under the overall heading of the objective logic. And then there is a book 3 of the logic, which is called the subjective logic, and that's the logic of the concept. And basically, so here he's going to continue bringing out the categories you need to comprehend reality. But here you get a set of categories that are of a different kind than are included in Kant's table of the categories. Something beyond either the mathematical or the dynamical categories. And these are basically the categories for comprehending freedom. These are basically the categories that you would need to characterize the relationship of something that is self-determining. And so I said Hegel's philosophy is in a fundamental way about freedom. So, and I was talking initially about his logic. His logic is a book that tries to show you what kinds of relationships sort of have to exist or have to be there for reality to be there. And there is such a thing as freedom, and you're going to have categories of freedom. And similarly, if you encounter something free, you're not going to understand it unless you operate with these kind of categories. You won't be able to grasp it. Now, I'm not going to talk about the logic. Well, I did. I'm not going to be spending a series of lectures on the logic. As I said, we're going to talk about the phenomenology of spirit. But I wanted to introduce you to those ideas about the logic, both for your general edification, I guess, and also for the purpose of reminding you to think in terms of logic and logical sophistication. To hold on to that distinction we made in Kant between the mathematical and the dynamical categories, and to notice that there are certain kinds of experiences you can have, and the fact that you have that experience means you are operating, you are thinking with, you are experiencing with a logic or an ability to recognize a kind of logic that may very well exceed some other kind of logical relationship you recognize or understand. So a simple logic of pushing and pulling will not explain telecommunications. Similarly, mathematical categories cannot explain experiences of freedom or phenomena of freedom, and neither can dynamical categories. There's something further that is necessary. I'm not going to say more about that, but I wanted to put that thought in your head as we now turn to looking at experiences of freedom. Actually, before turning to it, I want to say one more thing, just a quick thing about Hegel. And this may very well be something we get to. I'm not exactly sure how much I'm going to say in these lectures, so may or may not get here. But I said Hegel's philosophy is kind of about freedom, and so I mentioned that in relationship to the logic, but I also want to mention that in relationship to history. Is one of the things about Hegel is that it's a philosophy that is oriented, among other things, towards a study of history in a way that you won't really find in philosophy before that. I mean, you'd find it to some extent in Kant or to some extent in Fichte and so on, and a few others for sure. But it's not what Descartes' philosophy is about. It's not what Aquinas' philosophy is about. I guess I especially want to think about someone like Descartes. With Descartes and Spinoza, they may very well have remarks that they make about history, but they really are philosophers whose orientation is towards what we would normally think of as what we call science in our colloquial sense. I'm going to ignore technical sense of that word, but in a colloquial sense, what we would call science, right? The natural sciences. So they're very much occupied with what it takes to know the natural world, which is the sort of background to that is what Kant was studying in the Transcendental Aesthetic, and especially the Transcendental Analytic in the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant identified the phenomenon of freedom as something that stands outside our cognition of nature, basically. Something similar than what's going on with Hegel, thinking back on what I already said about the science of logic, the phenomenon, the reality of freedom, the phenomenon of freedom, whatever the word is we're going to use, involves a logic that exceeds either what Hegel would call the logic of being or the logic of essence. It operates with categories that exceed either the mathematical or the dynamical categories. And so Hegel, similarly then, it doesn't take nature in the way we typically understand it. He doesn't take that as the preeminent or ultimate exemplification of reality. Freedom is reality at its fullest, reality at its most real. And so history, more than nature, is the place to turn to see reality happening, reality unfolding. In a similar way, there's a kind of timelessness to nature. Of course, nature changes, and you can talk about this came before that and so on. You can even say this is built on that, but the very notion of natural causality is, in a way, the enduring sameness of the whole. Whereas history is about novel transformation and origination, precisely because it is the domain of freedom, which is the point I'm about to make. History is the domain where new things happen, where things are originated and a kind of reality comes into being that was not there before. And so Hegel's philosophy, again, one of its distinctive or defining features is that it involves a philosophy of history. History becomes a central area of philosophical study in a way that it wasn't for at least a few hundred years before that. Was it ever? Maybe in certain ways in Plato and Aristotle you see it, but pretty much it's really a thing that comes into being after Kant. I mean, you see it in Vico, who's kind of another, just as Kant is a foundation for this whole tradition, Vico is in a different way. But basically the real philosophical focus on history is a new thing. So it's part of late modern philosophy, not early modern philosophy, and it represents a fundamental philosophical change. And anyway, so to now say explicitly the point I sort of pulled out implicitly before, for Hegel, history is the enactment of freedom. So if you read the introduction to his lectures on the history of philosophy, philosophy of history, introduction to lectures on the philosophy of history, he basically wants to say, what's history about? Well, it's about freedom. It's the moving cause, the material cause, the formal cause, the final cause. Like that's what you're seeing in history is the reality of freedom realizing itself, freedom bringing itself into being, freedom showing what it is, freedom finding out what it is. So yeah, like I said, so that's orienting you with respect to Hegel's system as a whole, just to get some provocative and worthwhile thoughts bubbling in your mind as we now turn to our study, which is the experience of freedom. This is going to be the phenomenological issue. Right? We're going to ask, what is the phenomenon of freedom? We're going to ask, what is it like to experience oneself as free? And we're going to ask the corresponding question, what is it like to experience someone else as free? And that's actually not just an interesting correlation, that's going to turn out to be the thesis or the conclusion, depending on how you want to frame it. Hegel's study of self-consciousness, which is what we're going to look at, is the study of that being or those experiences of saying I or of recognizing ourselves as selves, and those are experiences of freedom. Those are recognizing ourselves as a free source of activity, the one who's responsible for how our experience unfolds. And so freedom and self-consciousness are going to turn out to be pretty much the same. And let me remind you again, now I'm using freedom in a very colloquial sense, not in the somewhat narrow or technical sense he's going to use here. But yeah, we're gonna see that freedom and self-consciousness are basically the same thing. But then also here's the other point: when we ask what is it to experience another free self-consciousness, we're going to see that experience of other free self-consciousness is always involved either implicitly or explicitly in our experiences of ourselves as self-consciousnesses and as free beings. And this is the thing then that Hegel is particularly going to show us, that the phenomenological study of self-consciousness reveals. Right? It's going to show that freedom, or let's say self-consciousness is something only accomplished cooperatively. Self-consciousness is always, in a certain sense, a shared experience. That it's how we are self-conscious. That and how we are self-conscious cannot be separated from the form our interaction with other self-consciousnesses take, and a particular aspect of that form. Not just the fact that my arms happen to interact with the arms of another free self-consciousness, or my back happens to be up against the back, not that kind of interaction. Interaction at the level of how we do or do not acknowledge honestly that other person is a free self-consciousness. So this Hegel's the central notion in Hegel is the notion of recognition, which is about how one is recognized by another and how one recognizes another. And that the relevant sense of recognizing there is how the other person is or is not honestly acknowledging that you are a free self-consciousness, and whether and how you are acknowledging that that other is a free self-consciousness. And basically, what Hegel's going to show is that in any situation where we don't really recognize other free self-consciousnesses for what they are, there is an inherent problem. There's an inherent problem in how we recognize ourselves, also in how we recognize the other person, and that is going to be played out in the discovery of problems in the way we have our interaction. So the interpretation of the other as a free being or not, the interpretation of yourself as a free being or not, and the form your interaction with that other person takes are three ways of talking about exactly the same thing. That self-consciousness is always simultaneously a practice of recognizing, well or poorly, other self-consciousnesses. And said the other way around, self-consciousness is always a practice of being recognized, a practice of being recognized poorly or well by other self-consciousnesses. That's roughly what the so-called dialectic of recognition, or Anerkennung, is about. And that's I'm focusing on that in Hegel because, along with all the many other brilliant and great things that Hegel talks about, this is, I think, probably the most pivotal one for his whole philosophical project. I think if you didn't have this, you wouldn't have Hegel, and if you have this, you can pretty much get everything else. I mean, I think this is really the most the core. This is the real core of the basic philosophical position that is Hegel's philosophy, and that's one reason for focusing on it. Another reason for focusing on it is I think it's very powerful. Studying it and learning what's being said there is a very powerful set of lessons for one's own life. It's very illuminating for making sense of one's own experience. And then third, from the point of view of our studying phenomenology, this is the natural place to go. It will carry forward the story, and all of this will set us up very well for talking about various things in 20th century phenomenology. So that's already a little bit of what we're doing. So I've already actually said quite a bit about freedom, dancing around it a bit, but there's quite a bit to think about already in those things that I've said. But I want to now turn directly to those kind of phenomenological questions and talk about that a little bit and get us a little bit into the text, and just to get rolling on this topic. And so let's think first about what it's like to experience yourself. So when you say, I'm self-conscious, that means you're conscious of yourself. So how are we conscious of ourselves? Well, we're used to thinking of that at that reflective level, right? Of saying, I'm a university teacher or whatever. But that is a reflective level, and that's not where things start. So there are ways in which we experience ourselves that are different from and more basic than that reflective apprehension of ourselves as um, what goes along with that? Well, as a coherently identifiable person in the world who fits with other people in a set of social interactions and so on. That last thing I said was a quick attempt to say what that reflective notion of the I is like. And in fact, let me just riff on that a little bit longer before I get back to what the other way is, the more basic way is. If you do think of how we usually think of ourselves, like I do say, like I'm a university professor, or I say my name is John, or I say, I'm a dad, or I'm a son, or something like that. We identify ourselves. We identify ourselves uh, by our career, like a central point from Plato's Republic. Uh, we identify ourselves by the thing we spend our life doing, which is a meaningful task in the world that other people function in too. So, like I'm a lawyer, I'm a university teacher, I'm a carpenter. Um, there you're saying here's the recognizable task I engage in that fits in the broader division of labor that is sort of how the whole society carries out its practice of taking care of itself or something like that. Or we say I'm a dad, and there you say, well, there are these things called families, and we all know what the possible members are, and of the 4 possible members that are available, or I guess we include grandparents, there'd be more, but let's just say the little nuclear family, mom, dad, son, daughter, on the sort of standard model. Of course, in reality, things are a lot more complicated than that. But in the traditional model of a heterosexual marriage and binary genders and so on, there's mom and dad, son and daughter. That's what there can be. So you say, well, of the 4 ones that can be, well, I'm this one. Or when I say I'm a son, which I also am, once again, I'm doing the same thing. Think about whatever else you would say. I won't go through more examples, but think about what other ones you might say. And you notice that they're all ways of identifying yourself by taking the kind of world of how people interact and the ways that we interpret people in general and sort of figuring out which of those categories fit you. Where do you fit in? And as I said at the beginning of this little, or right before the beginning of this little digression, you're identifying yourself as the one who makes choices about your life and who's the one who originates action. Like you say, like I'm going to go downtown today, or I'm going to pick up this pencil, whatever. Right? So, in all of those ways that those are ways we reflect on ourselves, but they're also kind of unreflective in the sense that we unreflectively adopt these interpretive means. So, in all these kinds of unreflective ways that we reflect on ourselves, in all these kinds of everyday ways that we interpret ourselves, we essentially posit ourselves as these little isolated but otherwise indivisible, so atoms of causality, one among many. Like we're all here together. There's a self there. There's a self there. There's a self there. There's a self there. Buddhism is famous for denying the self. People can mean a lot of different things by the self, and there are lots of ways in which people could and have argued that there are various conceptions of the self that Buddhism in fact endorses, and that's as may be. But what kind of self does Buddhism challenge? Pretty much this one I've just been describing. Now, Buddhism challenges it both, I suppose you could say, metaphysically and ethically, or something like that. So Buddhism, I don't think, as a long-standing, more or less religious and cultural tradition, I don't think it's fundamentally metaphysical and philosophical in that sense, although of course it has that branch to it. Brilliant philosophers, but it's more, I think, it challenges that you are this thing we've just described, but it tends to challenge that more in the kind of practical way of saying, it challenges more the sense of ego. It challenges more the way that a certain kind of interpretation of ourselves and how we matter and all that sort of stuff gets in the way of our feeling and acting well. So why am I saying that? I'm saying that not because I particularly want to get into that issue of analyzing our feelings, though it's very important, but more I guess just because I want to fill out a little bit more of like how we normally think about ourselves, and just to sort of get you to start thinking about the usual way we have a kind of self-experience. So we emotionally have a kind of self-experience that's associated with something like ego, and we have a theoretical view that kind of goes along with that. Just a little bit more about ego, and then that's actually going to make a natural transition to the point I'm really after here. There are different ways you can be troubled at the level of ego. Like you can want to win in a football game, get a prize, something like that, or you can also be a little bit burned when someone doesn't accord you appropriate levels of respect and acknowledgement and so on. And I guess there, I guess the point I want to make there is just that experience of feeling slighted helps to draw attention to the way that way you identify yourself as a doctor, who's a dad, and all that sort of stuff. It's not just a listing of objective facts like I'm 6 feet tall and I have brown hair or whatever. Every one of those we do those things too, but the other ones I mentioned, like that I'm a dad or that I'm a doctor, or that I'm a partier, they could have more to do with how you behave in social life, those ones have to do with not just objective features like brown hair or 6 feet tall or whatever, but they have to do with a role. They have to do with how you identify yourself in the terms by which your social system works. And so they're terms, they're ways in which you apply a kind of roughly universal language or universal logic to yourself, right? The terms that we all use to think about things, these are the ones you should use when you're thinking about me. But that very way of interpreting ourselves then involves other people, right? These are the ways other people should interpret us. And so we feel slighted or whatever when other people don't recognize us in the terms that we think we're supposed to be recognized by. Right? So just to go back to the sort of words I was saying before, it's not just about objective features, it's about social structures of interpretation. And indeed, when I say I'm a doctor, by which I mean, I am a doctor, but I'm a doctor of philosophy, and that's not what most people mean. And they'd actually be kind of annoyed at me if I said, yes, I'm a doctor. And they said, oh, well, I have this pain in my back. And I said, well, I'm not that kind of doctor. They'd say, no, you're just not a doctor. So colloquially, by doctor, we mean a medical doctor. And so if I were a medical doctor, other things come with that. Like I expect a certain level of salary. I expect, lots of people have written about the psychology of doctors from a long time ago, 1950s. I can't immediately remember the guy's name now, but it was writing about the God complex, and the way that it's common, not universal, but it's common for medical doctors to have a pretty big view of how important their judgment and interpretation of things is. If you are a healthcare professional and you think that's a dated and unhealthy stereotype, well then I'm sorry if I'm misrepresenting doctors now, which I don't particularly want to do. My father was a doctor. What I'm trying to do is only to report on what I think is a pretty common cultural perception of people who have that profession. And even if it is wrong, in fact, for lots of doctors who are great people and so on, um, it certainly is one thing one can encounter in the world with doctors. Um, uh, Maybe with university teachers, like they think they're wise, or whatever. Um, Parents think they're wise. Um, of course, there's a tremendous amount of variability in all these things. What I'm hoping to bring out though is just that whether these things are universal or even whether they're just kind of idiosyncratic, people have associations or expectations related to their professions and their careers that again aren't just about I do this sort of job. They're also about certain levels of social status, certain levels of social reward. And going back to the thing I was saying before, I was saying, that in fact there are lots of different things that can go on in families between a heterosexual couple and children that are defined by binary gender classification. Um, but there are an awful lot of people who are heterosexual, and there are a lot of people who operate with binary gender identification. And when people do that, again, not every single one for sure, but in a way, something about the way that whole system works is that identification means you have expectations as a general rule, right? Like if when you call it heterosexism, that means people operate with the expectation that there are going to be men and women, and men are going to be sexually attracted to women, and women are going to be sexually attracted to men. And consequently, people who live with that view about themselves also live with that view about other people, and they enter into relationships expecting things to unfold along those lines. And they get mad when things don't go that way, right? And in their behavior, I mean, this, if you think about the notion of gender performance, people thinking that you're a man or a woman isn't just a biological thing. It comes with it all kinds of other views about what boys are supposed to be, what it is to be masculine, what it is to be feminine, right? That's part of what the cultural meaning of man and woman typically is. And again, people can have different views. There can be lots of variations. But what I'm getting at is that those ways that we identify ourselves, the ways we define a self, the ways we interpret ourselves and think that that's what I am, typically are not neutral recognitions of factual, objective features about ourselves, but are rather matters of roles and expectations regarding social interaction. And that means both expectations about how other people should respond to us and expectations about how we should present ourselves. So what I wanted to get at then, so I want to complete now this point that I was trying to make, and that will allow me now to go back to Hegel's book and make the same point. The point I was trying to make is, by starting with our everyday sense of I tried to say what it was, and tried to talk about the sort of thesis that is implicit in it. Whether or not we've ever explicitly thought about it, there's a certain view about what a self is that's built into that. And then I reminded you that Buddhism has criticized that, just to remind you that why might someone think there is no such thing as a self in that sense? And then in relationship to that, I tried to bring out the way that sense of self, which putatively is a claim about our objective factual character, might be a wrong claim, but that's what it is in a way meant to be. We take ourselves really to be something like that. It's really a highly emotionally charged interpretation of our place in a big role-playing game. of our place in a social system of mutual interpretation that involves rules, that involves expectations about how we are to behave in a way that is congruent with or implied in that identity, and how others are to behave towards us in a way that is consistent with that identity. So I was trying to show, in other words, that what we take to be a simple matter of the reality that I am on my own, the factual reality that I am on my own, is actually not that. It's actually a card we're playing in a very elaborate social system of mutual interpretation and, to use Hegel's word, recognition. So I was trying, just by a kind of familiar set of observations, to bring out the idea that our sense of self is inherently rooted in what Hegel calls the dialectic of recognition. Don't worry about the word dialectic. It's inherently rooted in a system of recognition, a system of playing to and depending upon the expectations of others for our sense of self. And that means, I just add one word to it, for our sense of self-worth. A notion that's kind of captured nicely in ego, which both means I, but it also means our sense of our own value. So if that's right, then we take it that we just are these isolated selves who we are. You are a self. But what we discover is that no, what there is a relationship of recognition, a relationship of mutual interpretation, and so on. So that behind or prior to the I is a relationship in and through which the I-ness of the participants is constituted, not one where people are initially I's in all that fully developed sense, and then they go on to do something. No, a relationship between subjects such that through their interacting, they're each or all going to be able to be, in the relevant sense, selves, I's. So you're never an I on your own. You're an I only with others who are also being an I. And I'm able to be an I, and you're able to be an I, because together we're jointly enacting a kind of a system for mutual interpretation, right? Where we both basically agree to the rules of the game. So even though I am a different I from you, we're specifically different. On a more basic level, we're playing the same game. So it's like this is something we're doing together, and that's why Hegel says in one of his most often quoted remarks. This is in paragraph, is it 175? 170? Where is it, this most famous thing? Why can't I find it? Oh, there, sorry, 177, paragraph 177. This is the last paragraph of that long sort of introductory section about life and so on. This is the last paragraph that's now leading him to say, okay, so now we're going to talk about self-consciousness in the rich sense. In this paragraph, he says, 177, paragraph 177, it's page 110, but I'm not going to say page numbers in the book. I'm just going to say paragraph numbers. Paragraph 177, a self-consciousness in being an object is just as much I as object. With this, we already have before us the concept of Geist, or spirit. What still lies ahead is the experience of this, spirit. But what lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is, this absolute substance, which is the unity of the different independent self-consciousnesses, which, in their opposition, enjoy perfect freedom and independence. I that is we, and we that is I. So, I that is we, and we that is I. All I wanted to bring out through my little talk here so far was that idea. I wanted on our own to get to that point where you could see why the I is always a we, and the we participate in takes the form of us recognizing each other as eyes. So I wanted to just bring you to that. So now, having just gone through that, and again, ideally having brought you just through a little bit of reflection on your own experience to seeing something of the Hegel's language, the structures of recognition that are presupposed by and that underlie our experience of ourselves as selves. I want to now go back and finally get around to answering that question I initially asked: what is it like to experience yourself as a self? So I said, this is the way when we think about it, this is the way we reflectively do it. But there are more basic ways that we experience ourselves as selves. And the way Hegel starts is with what he calls desire. When you desire something, we can also talk about this with the dog and the cat. I'm not going to take this up in relationship to those other life forms, at least not at the moment, for reasons somewhat similar to the reasons that came out when I was differentiating other life forms from free human beings when talking about Kant and Heidegger in the past. For somewhat similar reasons, I'm going to talk about desire as that exists for you and me, for beings that are capable of being reflectively self-conscious. So I want you to think about your desire. When you desire something, like when you're hungry and you're looking around for something to eat, and you look at the I don't know, frozen pierogies, and that doesn't look like anything, and you look at a box of cereal and you go, and then maybe you see maybe even look at chocolate and you go, I don't want that kind of thing. And then you see a nice pear and you think, yeah, that's it, and you eat it. You're looking at these things and you're not asking yourself, what is a pear? What is a piece of chocolate? What is breakfast cereal? What are pierogies? You no doubt know, and it's not that you fail to be able to have that familiar objective knowledge of the thing, but that's not the way those things are figuring in your perspective when you're looking around hungrily. You're looking for something to eat, and you're looking for the thing that will satisfy you. And so you're looking for the thing, in this case the pear, that's relevant from the point of view of your desires. And so you are, and when you hit upon the pear and you eat it, that's great. So in and through the pear, you're able to basically fulfill yourself. You're able to get what you want. So you are seeing the pear in terms of you and your desires. So all I'm trying to get at there is, yeah, you're certainly in engaging with the pear. You're certainly engaging with something that is objectively different from you. Right? So if you pull back and if you're watching someone else do it, you can say that person is visually recognizing whatever the Latin name for pears is, and you could say all those things. But when you're doing it, actually the only thing you're engaged with is yourself. Yes, and let me qualify that just so you understand exactly what I mean. Yes, you're engaging with something that is in fact objectively different from you, and it's not that you fail to notice that. But the thing you are concerned with is yourself and your fulfillment, and you are seeing it insofar as it can be the way that you get to be realized. The thing that is defining you gets to function in the world. So the pear matters not according to what pears need. Like from the point of view of the whatever the species, whatever the life form is that the pear is part of, like that pear functions as a seed pod, right? There are seeds inside it, and there's this really big thing around it that both protects the seed and probably will supply it with essential nutrition when it falls on the ground and so on. I don't exactly know how pears work, but that's where the new pear plant is going to come from. So from the point of view of the pear, not that pears have a point of view, let's use Hegel's language, in terms of the logic of the pear as a life form, that's the seed, and the thing that's carrying the seed, and that's what's going to allow the pear life to continue now in the form of a new living individual. There was one pear tree, and it dropped the pear fruit on the ground, and eventually the pear seed in the heart of that fruit is going to germinate and sprout, and a new individual living pear tree is going to grow up. And there will not have been any interruption in the livingness that went from that pear tree to the fruit to the seed. It was always alive, right? The little pear seed used to be part of that pear tree. Like the fruit used to be part of the pear tree, and the seed was part of that fruit, and then the fruit fell off. But that thing that used to be part of the single living individual that was the tree is now the smallest little part of a new living individual. It's going to be a new tree, right? And there's a continuation of the life form, and it's going to make new fruit and so on. If you're going to talk about the logic of life and the logic of that pear, the life form that pear is a part of, it's about the perpetuation of that stream of life. And that's not at all what you're doing when you're eating the pear. When you're eating the pear, it is defined in terms of the unique interests and desires of you, this person. And so when you operate from desire, you do approach an other, but you approach an other not from the point of view of preserving and protecting its self-defined otherness. You approach that other as the way to fulfill yourself. And so the desire is, Hegel identifies desire as, in a way, the basic, the sort of primitive experience of self-consciousness, because that's where you have a sense of whether or not you've reflected upon yourself, you are living from a sense of yourself as the one who is defining things. When you're living from desire, the world is about you. Right? So the whole world becomes a kind of mirror of you. Like cereal, not relevant. So effectively, nothing. Pierogies, nothing. Pear, yeah, that's how I get what I want. Just a little bit more about that. So I'm trying to get you just to think about desire, and again, I'm distinguishing this from reflective self-consciousness, where you look back at yourself. Like you can say, "I want a pear," but that's not even probably phenomenologically accurate for describing desire. But it's more that the pierogies look undesirable or look unappetizing, and the pear looks appetizing. And so in desire, more commonly, the phenomenon is that you look around and this is attractive. This is repulsive or unattractive. So the pear looks attractive. Well, that's again not about something intrinsic to the life of a pear as pear. It looks attractive because it's defined in terms of your desire, but you're experiencing yourself through how you see the object. Through the allure of the object is essentially a reflection of your desire, a reflection of you. I'm not going to go on about that in much more in the actual analysis. There's quite a bit more to say. I want to make two quick points about it. One thing is that Hegel is just the first one, because it picks up on that last point I made. One thing that Hegel's going to say is, like, the logic of desire is not a good enough thing to live by. I mean, you can, but it's a logic that is insufficient both to comprehending yourself and to comprehending the world. And you can see it well enough just in the point I made, right? If you're only seeing the pear in terms of its allure for you, you're acting like it has no independent weight. And in a certain sense, there's a contradiction involved there, because you need the pear to be other to you because you need there to be an independent realm in and through which you're going to fulfill your desires. And so you both depend on the pair to be an independent reality, and you refuse to acknowledge its independent reality. You can, imagine how that works with another person. You can treat another person only in terms of your desires, and you might not treat them very nicely if you really are only interested in your own desires. But if you get pleasure from that means at some level you actually depended on that other person, um, uh, but you're now failing to acknowledge that in the way that you um, treat them. My son is calling, so I'm going to have to pause here and then come back. Okay, well, you just saw recognition in action. You can't call yourself dad and not feel yourself drawn away when the little boy calls you. Let me try to remember what I was saying. Oh yeah, I was talking about the way that when you desire the pair, you're basically in the pair only seeing a reflection of yourself, and you're not really owning up to, for lack of a better expression, its independent integrity or reality and so on. Your desire, in other words, trumps its reality. And then I was trying to give an example of that, and I might have got a little incoherent there just because I was listening to this little guy. But so what I was saying there is you can experience that in relationship to another person. You might relate to another person only in terms of your own desires, but it's that other person, or it's another person that you have those desires for, or I should say that you find desirable. You might find another person desirable and live out your desires, and yet not respect or pay any heed to that other person's needs or interests as a person. And there, it's kind of like you're not paying your debts, right? You depend on that person being there as another person to give you what you want, and yet in your relationship to them, you're not relating to them in a way that acknowledges or recognizes the needs or the demands of that relationship you're depending on. So I was talking in relationship to Hegel's logic before. Remember, I was talking about how some relationships are more sophisticated than others, and so on. It's like trying to understand telecommunications with the logic of push and pull. It's not going to work. But so in a relationship of just relating to another person out of your own desires with no regard to their existence or needs as a person, you're bringing push and pull to them, but what you're reaping the rewards of is telecommunication, right? And so you're depending on a logic that's more sophisticated than the one you're explicitly holding yourself answerable to. Anyway, that was I was drawing on the other thing just to I hope just say something that's sort of intuitively recognizable about the way how in desire you can depend upon there being a certain kind of other there, but you can relate to it in a way that doesn't measure up to that well. So that's the thing Hegel's going to say about desire in general. Desire needs the independent other, but it only relates to the other as something dependent, as something defined by its own interest, by desire's own interest. So the logic of desire itself is insufficient, doesn't sufficiently answer up to the terms of the world in which it exists and functions. Like I said, though, I'm not going to analyze that in detail. I want just to make that one point, particularly because that will help you to read some of his paragraphs, and that's probably in paragraph 175. He would say that. But anyway, in case you're reading, you will find him make that point. But I wanted to get back to this other stuff. I said there were 2 points, and I was really distracted by having to interrupt there. Can I remember what the other point was that I wanted to make? No, but it will reappear. So I hope I'm not just leaving a big loose end hanging there that means you can't make sense of what I said. I doubt it. I want to just bring it back now to where I was trying to go and to work my way into Hegel's text. And actually, probably in doing that, I will probably make the point I was going to make. Actually, to begin, I'll start by getting to the text by going back to the first couple of paragraphs of the chapter, 166 and 167. Yeah, actually, this is from paragraph 167. I'll read the last half dozen or so lines of paragraph 167. In Miller, it's on page 105. So think about the situation that we've just been describing with desire. The pair initially appears other to me, but an attractive other. It draws me, right? And fulfillment comes by precisely eliminating the pair's independent existence. I eat it, right? So desire begins in a kind of state of self-alienation. Like what desire begins by finding itself attracted by an object that is separate from it, and it is then the process of overcoming, which is to say getting rid of that alienation. I was giving the example of hunger. Desire takes other forms than that. In the case of the pear, I'm just going to eat it, and so it really is going to disappear. But other forms of desire, in an analogous way, would remove that alienation. But anyway, let me read here. The antithesis of its appearance and its truth. Let me add something else about that. Hegel, the title of this chapter is The Truth of Self-Certainty. Throughout this whole book, Hegel relies on the language of certainty and truth and their opposition. And by certainty, he means basically the conviction you live by. And truth means what turns out to be the case. So, basically, if you think of the pear, it's separate from you, but you kind of, desire means you approach it with the certainty that it's for you, and you prove that you're right by eating it. So desire is really the certainty, that is to say, the sort of lived sense of conviction that what you want is what matters. And in a kind of an immediate way, through carrying out, in this case, eating, in carrying it out, you prove you were right. The point I was making before about desire depending on its object, but not approaching it in terms sufficient to ultimately live up to it. If we pursued that more fully, Hegel would be trying to show that the truth of this is that the object has more independence than is recognized in desire, certainty, or something like that. Like that's kind of the way he would use that language. But I'm not going to pursue that here. I just wanted to mention that language because it's going to be important later, but also because it's sort of relevant to the language he uses here, the antithesis of its appearance and its truth. This antithesis of its appearance and its truth, he's talking about it is self-consciousness in that case. This antithesis of its appearance and its truth has, however, for its essence only the truth, namely the unity of self-consciousness with itself. So in the case of desire, you accomplish a kind of unity. You unite with your own desire by fulfilling it. So initially you sort of felt like desire is the feeling that you're the truth of that pair, but the appearance is one of alienation, like you're not the pair, so you're hungry. But when you eat it, it's like, yeah, I was right. My desire did define that thing, and I overpowered the pair and ate it. So your sense of yourself begins as a kind of certainty, and then in the action there, you kind of confirm it. And so that's what he means. He's not he's going to go on and talk about desire. He's actually saying something more general that I'm not going to worry about at the moment. But he says so about self-consciousness. Its truth is the unity of self-consciousness with itself. And then he says, self-consciousness is desire in general. So consciousness as self-consciousness henceforth has a double object. So consciousness as self-consciousness. Well, thinking back to Kant, we can always talk about consciousness. You can talk about you being conscious of an object, right? You encounter something. Normally, when you just think of consciousness, and this is what Hegel has studied in the preceding 3 chapters of the book, normally when you think of consciousness, you think of your object of awareness. Right? And so you say, what is my object? What is the object of my experience? Oh, the door. Well, when consciousness is self-consciousness, he says you have a double object. Because remember, the object of self-consciousness is yourself, right? If you think about that in the context of desire, the object is yourself, but that's something you're experiencing only through the way you're experiencing this object, right? So consciousness as self-consciousness henceforth has a double object. One is the immediate object, which is the object of sense, certainty, and perception, as his language, but that's the object you are conscious of as independent of you in the world, the independently existing reality. Right? One is the immediate object of sense, certainty, and perception, which, however, for self-consciousness has the character of a negative. Right? It's not the ultimate truth. The ultimate truth is for it to be not the independent thing that it appears as. It's going to be negated. So the way it exists right now is not its true form from the point of view of desire. It's gonna get its true form when you eat it. So the pear doesn't know it yet, but it thinks it's existing. It's real life there, but no, that's just something that's going to be superseded because you're going to show it that its truth is to be for you. So it has a double object. One is the immediate object, that of sense, certainty, perception, which, however, for self-consciousness has the character of a negative. And the second object, namely itself, which is the true essence of the experience, and is present in the first instance only as opposed to the first object, right? So that little, I just want to read that line because it seems to me he is describing the thing I was just talking about. And I really just wanted to bring out that notion of the double object. Like in desire, you are aware of the pear, but the pear is kind of only an intermediate way of experiencing yourself. So the pear is your object insofar as more basically your object is yourself, your desire. You want to fulfill your desire. So your experience is about your interests, and you experience your own interests through the pear. So you have a double object, and for exactly that same reason, the pear has a kind of double existence. The way it initially exists is it appears to be independent, but through your activity of desiring, you're going to prove that its independence wasn't the truth, and that it really depended upon you. Right. So now this reminds me of what the thing was, the second thing I was going to say before I went to get my son. So the second point then about desire that I wanted to make is that desire, I'll use that kind of Fichte word, desire posits itself as the essence of things, or as the center of things. So desire is not a reflective attitude of thinking, oh, I desire this, I desire that. Desire is experiencing the pear as alluring, as attracting you, right? But what that means is you're experiencing the pear really only in terms of your desires. The object, the world you're encountering is being interpreted by your desires. That's what it's about. So desire is approaching the world in a way that's living from the sense that your desires are, that you are what matters. So it's not a matter of maintaining a philosophical thesis that you're the center of the world. It's a matter of living from the experience that you are the center of the world. Of course, you have desires, but you don't only have desires. You also have a much more sophisticated life. Like you live as a dad, and you where you've identified with relations of recognition, and you think you're a doctor and you're an adult and all kinds of other stuff. So you have a lot more to you than just your desires. And so you might say, well, yeah, I have those desires, but I don't treat myself as the center of the world and blah, blah, blah. Right. But imagine you only live with those desires. If that were the logic with which you approach things, there you would be operating from a lived sense that you're what defines everything. The reason for bringing that out is really because of that word everything. Right? When you live from desire, so in other words, intrinsic to the experience of desire as such, desire as such, or desire absolutely, not desire relative also to some other forms of experience you have that keep desire in its place, right? So I said, again, in relation to the logic, I said you can have some kinds of logical relationships, and you can have other ones that are more sophisticated because they build on that one, but they also outstrip it in some way. So you certainly can have desires, but you have come to take up your own existence in a way that subordinates the logic of desire to certain other kind of relationships that outstrip it. And so then your desires you're not a desiring being absolutely, you're a desiring being relative also to some other notions that more fundamentally define you. I want you to think about desire in the absolute sense. I want you to think about it that as if that were your only reality, living out of your desires. Then no check, right? The very premise of desire is that whatever is only is how it matters to you. As we saw in the example, yeah, you can have the pear as an object of sense certainty and perception in Hegel's language, right? You can recognize it as a thing in the world by objective standards of reality, the kind of thing we studied in Kant. But that's not the logic that you're operating with. You're operating with the logic of desire, for which the entire logic of reality has been subordinated, has been made relative to the more overarching logic of, yeah, it's real, but what is it for me? You can recognize it's there, but whatever is there is made subordinate to what you want it for, whether you care about it or not, whether you want it or not. Anyway, so I was talking about why I was bringing this up in this notion of the everything. The very meaning of desire is that, as I said, it knows no check. The very meaning of desire is that whatever is counts or doesn't count according to what you happen to be desiring or not. So from the point of view of my desire, in the example I gave before, pierogies are nothing, and the pear is everything. Well, everything except me, because I'm actually everything. So the pear is the only thing that isn't me that's anything. And it's not even actually not me. It only thinks it is, or it only imagines it. It's only existing as an alien because I haven't eaten it yet. Now I'm going to eat it. It's just going to be me. I'm kind of personifying the logic, but in doing that, I'm just trying to bring out, I'm trying to bring out the logic by turning into sort of characters interacting. But that is the basic logic of desire. It's the idea that your perspective and your interests are what matters. And so anything else counts. Anything else matters only if it matters to you. And what matters to you is the thing. And so notice then a little bit more about that point. So Hegel in a little while is going to call that simple being for self. Because desire in this absolute sense means that the whole world is just for you, and you are just for you, right? You everything is only about being for you. And so the lived sense of yourself, not a reflective positing where you say, I am something or other, but the living from the attitude that everything revolves around you and only everything matters only to you, right? That is, I am the only, and that overpowers everything. So you're simple being for self. You are simple being for self, and you are yourself precisely as the exclusion from yourself of everything, right? Whatever is has no status except insofar as it matters to me. So everything is only something I do or don't care about. So you can't be identified with anything in the world. You are an attitude that overpowers that outstrips and overreaches everything. So you're not identifiable with anything, and in that sense, that's all excluded from you. And that's how you are yourself. And then the only meaning of any of that is that it is for you. That relationship that I've tried to capture in those words is the thing that I hope you can take forward, and I hope it makes sense already. I'm going to say one more thing about it. I want to read you the first sentence of paragraph 186, because here he's going to say the thing I've just been trying to say, using almost the same language I just used, and I hope it will make sense to you. Paragraph 186, page 113, he says, self-consciousness is, to begin with, simple being for self, self-equal through the exclusion from itself of everything else. For it, I'll just read the next sentence too. For it, its essence and absolute object is I. And in this immediacy, or in this mere being of its being for self, it's an individual. It's a single, actually, is what Hegel says. Miller often doesn't translate very well the words for single and particular. Actually, specifically the word single and variation, singular, so on. Here he translated individual, which is almost right. Sometimes he translates it as particular, which is completely wrong. So I'm going to try to mark that out when it comes up. But anyway, that single means, the one and only. So I'll read those two sentences again. Self-consciousness is, to begin with, simple being for self, self-equal through the exclusion from itself of everything else. For it, its essence and absolute object is I, right? That's what it's all about. Remember back in 167, he said, the second object, namely itself, is the true essence, right? So yeah, its essence and absolute object is I. Not I in the sense of the reflectively posited ego or anything like that, but I in the sense of itself as the perspective, the point of orientation in relationship to which everything else is defined. And in this immediacy of its being for self, it is a single. It is the one and only, the unique one and only. And let me even read the next sentence. What is other for it is an unessential, negatively characterized object. Well, that's what I've been trying to say, right? That the pair on its own is only insofar as it is for me. So it's either nothing or it's something insofar as it is to be overcome and made into me. So it's unessential. I'm essential. Everything else is unessential. And whatever I do notice is negatively characterized. That is to say, the way it is not the ultimate truth. So those are the first three sentences of paragraph 186. And I hope that they all pretty much make sense. As I said, I want to give one more little example, which is quite relevant to the thing we're going to go on to, that I hope will make the significance of that even clearer if it isn't already. But I actually hope that it's clear enough now. But here's one more example, and this is about the everything character. You talk about eating something or whatever, but think about suicide or a hunger strike or anorexia, something like that. You might have thought, just listening to me talk, you might have thought, oh yeah, there's the cup, and that's what matters to this living individual. You might have thought that's what I was talking about desire. Like this living individual gets hunger, and so I shouldn't say cup, I should say pear, whatever. You might have thought this living individual gets hungry for biological reasons, and so it's going to respond to that pear to satisfy its hunger and so on. That's not quite what I was saying, because it's close, but it's not quite. Here's why it's not quite. That way of thinking would have identified me with my biological organism, but my desire goes beyond that, right? And the simple proof of that is that I can dislike my biological organism and reject it, right? Which is to say, dislike or whatever. I mean, I can just decide that for me, my biological organism is a negatively characterized object. I can say, I don't like this life. I don't identify with this life, and so I'm going to end it. Right? Or I can, in similar ways, I can starve myself. I mean, that's ultimately going to result in my death. If I'm on a hunger strike there, I may not so much be saying, oh, I want to end my life, but what I'm showing is my will or my desire. I mean, a hunger strike is a pretty reflective thing. So probably people who engage in hunger strikes are not, definitely they're not the stance of desire, absolutely. But by thinking about them, you can see an aspect of desire. Namely, I can say that what I desire is to, this would be a very reflective thing, but I want to protest racist police violence or something, and I'm going to go on a hunger strike. And what I'm going to do by starving myself to the point of death, if necessary, is I'm going to show that my beliefs and my commitments, what I self-consciously posit, is what I'm defined by, and I'm not defined by more organic needs. Anorexia, is probably a very similar thing, and it has very similar structure. It's not and you can imagine mom saying, "You need to eat," and you're going to say, "No, I don't need to eat. I need the exact opposite is true." And your mom says, "You need to eat, or you're going to die." You say, "Yeah, I'm going to die." Your mom may be swayed and overwhelmed by the necessity to preserve you as a living organism for who knows what reasons, but you don't have to be swayed by that. And the point is, it's not, you might in fact come to decide you want to do that, but what really runs you is your desires, not your organism. And so you don't have to be swayed by that. You might, as a matter of fact, not desire to preserve your living organism, and therefore you don't, which performs the proof that you don't need to, and demonstrates that your desire, and in the loose sense in which I'm using the term, your freedom outstrips natural necessity, outstrips the logic of organism, outstrips the logic of life. So, as an aside, logic of life is surely more sophisticated than the logic of push and pull. The logic of life is more sophisticated than the logic of simple presence that I said the science of logic begins with. So the logic of life is pretty sophisticated, but that simple example of anorexia proves that the logic of life is insufficient to account for the reality of freedom, because you as a free being can freely renounce your life. And so nothing you can say according to the terms that life operates by can compel your hand, can make make your freedom do otherwise, right? Your freedom just by fiat, by say so, has made that whole thing irrelevant. And nothing that comes up and like, oh, but now you have a disease, or but now you have an iron deficiency. Oh, but now your bones are breaking. Like, yeah, from the point of view of the logic of life, those are all pretty serious, but none of them have to matter to you. Just as the objective logic of life, there we're looking at it subjectively. We're looking at, well, actually, never mind that. The point would probably have been true, but it's not even that necessary. But just go back to the pair. The pair, the logic of its life isn't sufficient to account for your desire. So yeah, so I guess I will make that point. So like there, in an alien object, the logic of its life doesn't live up to the logic of your desire, or the logic of your self-consciousness in Hegel's terms. In your own case, the logic of your life doesn't live up to the logic of your self-consciousness. The logic of life in general is insufficient to speak to the terms of the logic of freedom, to the logic of self-consciousness. Okay, so I hope that those examples are reasonably clear, because we're now going to watch Hegel make more or less that example. So we're now looking at our self-consciousness in its most immediate form. And how do you most immediately experience yourself? As desire. That's the most basic way that you are for yourself. That's where you are finding the sense of your self-defined perspective within your experience. And then we've looked at the logic of it. We're going to see that logic of desire is ultimately insufficient to explain and account for our own self-conscious reality. But that's where it starts. So now, 186. I'll read those sentences again, and then we'll see what comes up. Self-consciousness is, to begin with, simple being for self, self-equal through the exclusion from itself of everything else. For it, its essence and absolute object is I, and in this immediacy, or in this being, simple being of its being for itself, it is a single. What is other for it is an unessential, negatively characterized object. Now the next sentence. But the other is also a self-consciousness. And one individual, one single, is confronted by another individual, another single. One unique one only, is confronted by another one and only. The logic of the pathetic old TV series called The Highlander captures this well, where the Highlanders have to meet each other and kill each other, and their slogan, principle they live by is, there can be only one. And that's what it means to be a one and only. There can be only one. So we're going to explain that now, but I just wanted to pick up on that language there. Okay, so I said we were going to talk about two things. I was going to ask you what it's like to experience yourself, and I was going to ask you what it's like to experience another person. Well, now, put all that stuff we've said on hold for a minute and just think about what it's like to experience another person. You can think what it's like to experience another living organism, a pear, tree, right? We've already talked about why what it is to be you, can't be sufficiently grasped by that logic of life. And so another being like you can't be grasped by the logic of a pear any more than you can be grasped by the logic of a pear. Can't be grasped by the logic of life any more than you can be. So now think about what it's like to experience another person. It's not going to be like experiencing another pear. You can certainly experience another human organism outside you. There you're experiencing, like the pear, something that's involved in processes of nutrition, growth, reproduction, so on. But if that's what you encounter when you encounter another human being, then you are only encountering life. You're not actually encountering another person. You are encountering another person, but you're not encountering another person as another person. You're encountering another self-conscious being, another human being, another being like yourself, but you're not encountering it as human, or as a person, or as self-conscious. because to encounter it in and as the thing it distinctively is would precisely be to encounter it, just as true as with encountering yourself, to encounter it as something that is desire. That is something that on its own is a simple being for self, self equal through the exclusion of all else, for whom its essence and absolute object is I, and for whom what is other is an unessential, negatively characterized object. Right? So just as you cannot be identified with your life, it cannot be identified with its life. Just as you cannot be identified with any particular part of your body, because if you want, you can cut off your finger. Maybe you're a whatever it would be, yakuza or something like that, or mafia or whoever it is. You committed an offense and you got to cut off your finger to prove that you're man enough to be part of the team. But people can do that. You can chop off your finger, so you can't be identified with your finger. You can, either because you think it's beautiful or because you're complaining about the way your parents treat you. You can carve up your face, you cut a piece of your nose off, you can put safety pins through, you can do all kinds of stuff. There's no specific thing about you that you're defined by. On the contrary, anything about you has as its meaning that it gets its meaning from your desire. So that's true of the other person too. So you see another person, and if you want to know what you're seeing when you see another person's finger, you got to know to in as much as that's part of the phenomenon of them, you got to know what they think about that finger. And that's why you offend people when you say, oh, your haircut looks so nice, and they hate their haircut. Or you say, you have beautiful eyes, and you hate your eyes because they remind you of your dad or something. Whatever. When you encounter another person and pick out some objective feature of them and treat it as if the meaning it has is either just objectively defined or defined by your perspective or defined by society's perspective, of course you're going to offend them, because for them it's defined by their perspective. And so, to treat that person as a person is to recognize that, and that means grasping that you don't know what you're dealing with when you encounter any objective feature unless they tell you, unless you find out from them. So think about that notion now about objective features, right? That means to experience another person is to experience the insufficiency in principle of anything objective to hand you that thing, right? The other is simple being for self, self equal through the exclusion from itself of everything, right? So that means any and every objective feature is insufficient. You have to know what the other person makes of it to know what it is. So you don't see the other person by seeing their outside. You only see the outside by getting to know the other person, right? You have to go through the other person to know what the outside is. You don't get the other person by grasping on your own terms the outside and then saying, oh, well, that person's the sum of those parts or anything like that. So there is nothing that could be objectively present. There's nothing that could be present. No organic feature. Yeah, I mean, even sound. They can say words to you, but with a person, you got to know how to take their words. You don't know whether they're lying or telling the truth. I mean, when you get to know a person well, then probably that isn't such an issue. But when a person first comes up to you and looks nice and wears a business suit and says, I'm a rich and respectable, honorable person, and I will always treat you nice, and I think you're fabulous, and so you should totally trust me. And you can go with that if you want. But there's nothing in either their appearance in their business suit and nicely trimmed features, or in their words, those sounds that are objectively present to you. There's absolutely nothing there that that on its own lets you know who the person is, right? There's nothing that lets you know if the way they seem is the way that person is, right? So there's nothing that could ever be present, which, remember, when we talked about the beginning of the science of logic, I said, that the most immediate character of things is simple presence, right? And that was part of what I called the objective logic, right? Well, there's nothing that could be present that would actually give you that person, right? Whatever is present, the reality that is that other person has already outstripped it. Presence as such is insufficient to give you the thing you're after, which is another person, a free being, right? And so, in a very rich sense of this, a very powerful sense, you experience another person as precisely a kind of absence. You experience the other person as something that is in principle absent from the objective realm. That doesn't mean non-existent. It means really real, right there. Because the whole point of the person is that that's the reality you're after, and whatever they are in their freedom that's the reality that defines these things. So in a sense, they're more real than any of this. So it's not absence as non-existence, it's absence as the more real originative source that shows itself through what is present, but is not reducible to or defined by that. So you experience another person as an absence that is presenting itself in and through what is present, even though it's irreducible to that, right? It's that other's inherently absent reality, absent from your direct experience and absent from the objectively defined features of the situation. That is, it is that other's absence that is the meaning of what you're encountering. But that's a meaning then that you can and do recognize, and you can grasp it, but it's not one that you sense. You can sense their eyes, you can sense the sound of the words they utter, you can sense their movements, etc., right? You can sense their possessions. Those things are sensibly present bits of objective reality. But the other as a person, as a desire, as a free being, as a self-consciousness, is something you can only experience as the source of those things that gives them meaning, that is itself never one of the present things, therefore never sensible. So it's something you can only ever grasp understandingly. You can understand it as the source, but you can only sense these things as its effects, right? And if you go back, just as a little quick reminder, if you go back to Kant talking about interpreting the Third Antimony, that's what he said about the relationship of freedom and nature, right? He talked about an intelligible action that has sensible effects, right? Like a person, an intelligible action is expressing to you their desire or expressing to you their concern. That's what they're doing. That's an action, and that's something you can understand. But all you sense is the effects of that free action on their part that takes the form of their hand moving like this to touch you on the shoulder, or these sounds coming out of their mouth saying, yeah, no, I'm sorry about that, or whatever it is. So it's an intelligible action with sensible effects. You see an objective tableau, whatever, outside you, but you understand it as, interpret it as an effect, and an effect of a cause, but of a certain kind of cause, not another piece of causality of organic nature, but precisely a kind of cause that outstrips the whole of organic nature. You experience it, you interpret it, experience it as the effect of a cause that is a spontaneous act of origination or freedom. So I was asking you what it's like to experience another person, and the thing is, you experience another person when you experience yourself as in the presence of an absence. You're in the presence of an absence that is a defining, desiring point of view that gives meaning to the objective features of the situation, but is not defined in terms of them, right? So I'm going back into things we said about your desire, and I'm just saying the same things about the other person, but I'm talking about what it's like to have that as your object, as opposed to living it as the subject. The relationships are all the same, but I'm trying to bring out a little bit what it's like experientially. Well, now let me just carry on now with this paragraph. So Hegel says, so put yourself in that situation of a desiring being, a being the stance of absolute desire, and encountering another stance of absolute desire and encountering it as such, right? What happens when you recognize another thing like yourself? You are the kind of being that can experience other people. What's it like to experience another person where the terms you're bringing to bear are those most basic terms of self-consciousness, namely desire, and where the other person that you're recognizing as another person is bringing those same things? So in other words, we're looking at the most primitive kind there could be of people recognizing each other as people. So I'm going to just talk through that now. I'm going to read basically from paragraphs 186 to 88, I think, parts of it, to talk about what that situation involves. And here Hegel is going to show how, in that experience, the people that are involved are going to, in living out their experience, demonstrate that the terms they're bringing to their experience are insufficient to that situation. So the push and pull is insufficient to telecommunications, and the logic of desire is insufficient to comprehend or to deal with relationships between people. And that will be demonstrated when you have relationships between people that appeal only to the logic of desire to realize themselves. I think you'll see what happens. So I'm just going to read now a little bit from Hegel's book and then talk about it. I'm just going to make this point, and then that's where we're going to stop for this lecture, and then we'll come back again and build on that. So paragraph 186, I'm going to read the same stuff again. I hope every time I read it that the things I've said are going to help to make it just have more and more meaning, so that these sentences, which initially must seem like baffling nothing, start to be extremely clear and straightforward expressions of some pretty important points that you now understand. Okay, so paragraph 186. Self-consciousness is, to begin with, simple being for self. Self-equal through the exclusion from itself of everything else. For it, its essence and absolute object is I, and in this immediacy, or in this mere being of its being for self, it is an individual. What is other for it is an unessential, negatively characterized object. But the other is also a self-consciousness. So one individual is confronted by another individual. Appearing thus immediately on the scene, they are for one another like ordinary objects, independent shapes, individuals submerged in the being or the immediacy of life. For the object and its immediacy is here determined as life. So yeah, if you imagine this happening, you encounter another person, but you encounter them as a pair, right? You encounter another person, and what you're confronted with is a thing in your world. It's another living being defined by your desire, like everything else. So even if you're recognizing it as a person, the way that person is present to you is as a living individual, right? So in this case, but that's what's happening with the other person in their experience of you too, right? Since the two of you are identical, whatever is true of your experience of that one is true of that one's experience of you, right? So they are for each other shapes of consciousness which have not yet accomplished the movement of absolute abstraction, the movement of rooting out all immediate being and of being merely the purely negative being of self-identical consciousness. Okay, you, as the stance of desire, have performed the absolute abstraction. To the extent that you live the absolute stance of desire, you're the person for whom nothing compels you. Your desire is the essence of everything. So that's absolute abstraction because you have excluded everything from yourself, right? You've abstracted yourself from everything. So what you encounter is another pair. That is to say, you initially encounter the other person not as that similar act of absolute abstraction, but as another thing that you're going to overpower. You're just another living individual. In other words, they have not as yet exposed themselves to each other in the form of being for self or self-consciousness, right? That's what's going to happen. And so now you can ask yourself, okay, how do you expose yourself to another as pure being for self? Somebody says you're a pair. How do you show them that you're not? Especially when you remember that the very meaning of this is that you're in absence, right? There's nothing that could ever be present that would be you put on display, right? So given that you can never be, in as much as you are desire, you could never be an objective presence, right? How can you display yourself as an act of absolute abstraction to another, in the face of another? And the answer is in a twofold way. If you are the absolute abstraction of pure desire, then that means that other one must be for you just a pair. And so you will demonstrate yourself to be the outstripping and overpowering logic that is desire by making that pair, which is another person, reflect your desires, right? You will show that its independent shape is not ultimate, that it ultimately depends on you. So it's up to your desire to determine what stance it's in. So for you, that other person is a life form subordinate entirely to your whim. It's up to you whether it lives or dies. On the other hand, the way you will demonstrate that you exist as absolute abstraction is by not giving a fuck about your own life, right? It's by showing that there's nothing objective in this world that defines me. So just as I overpower your life, I am also not ruled by my life. So the way you expose yourself as a self-consciousness in this most basic sense, the way you expose yourself as a self-consciousness to another one is by holding your life at nothing for the sake of showing that you hold their life at nothing. Right? Another person does exactly the same thing. That other person exposes themselves to you as a self-consciousness by holding their life at nothing in order to show that they hold your life at nothing. So the recognition of one self-consciousness by another in its most basic form begins as people risking their lives to try to kill each other. Right? He calls it the life and death struggle. So he says, they have not as yet exposed themselves to each other in the form of pure being for self, or they have not exposed themselves to each other in the form of self-consciousness. Each is indeed certain of its own self. Certain, remember, meant you live with the conviction that. So you live with the certainty that you're the center of the world. You're encountering someone else who thinks they're the center of the world. You're going to have to prove that you're the one. right? You're going to have to prove that your certainty is the truth, right? So we're looking at the truth of self-certainty. You each have a certainty. You're each singularities. You're each one and onlys, but there can be only one. Right? Each is indeed certain of its own self, but not of the other. I say I'm the center of the world. I don't think you are. You claim to be the center of the world. You're not. Right? But here the interesting thing is this. There's a kind of challenge that comes to you from another self-consciousness that doesn't come to you from a pair. So the pair can't push you to risk your own life. You might or might not do it, but you're just going to eat the pair. The interesting thing here is whatever you're doing, the other one is doing. So the other is trying to prove him or her or their self. I guess there would be the only one that makes sense here, because it's not defined by anything, let alone, biological or cultural versions of binary gender. So they're trying to prove themselves to be the only one, and so they're operating with the assertion that you're nothing, but you're operating with the assertion that you're everything. So there's a particular kind of challenge that you're recognizing by someone who's coming to you. So so when that other person comes at you trying to prove their essentiality, you must respond by proving their inessentiality and your essentiality, right? That's the very meaning of experiencing another person as another self-consciousness, then, is to experience yourself as challenged in your primitive core sense of yourself, qua absolute desire, as the center of things. And so when you encounter a pair, you're certain that your desire is what matters. But at the moment, the pair is existing there independently. So you haven't proved that your desire is what matters until you eat it, right? And then you show that your desire was the truth of the situation. So in a way, the pair just stands there as a kind of challenge to you. It says, no, I'm independent, and then you prove it to be wrong. With another person, the kind of challenge is a little bit different, right? Because the other person challenges you in a way that where they're really like the pair can't really put up a fight, but the other is really coming at you with the claim that they're nothing, the same claim that you're coming at them with. And so so the issue here is, how are you going to prove yourself in the setting where the other thing that challenges you is a self like you? And the point is, you're going to fail. So I've tried to set up a double thing, right? The distinctive kind of situation that is you encountering another self, but I've also been setting that up sort of on analogy with the situation of the pair, right? So I want you to see now the problem that comes out of this. If you're challenged by another self, if something else is effectively saying you're nothing, and that other self is willing to die for it because they say, I'm not defined by my life, then the way that you're going to prove yourself to be the one by risking your life and taking theirs isn't quite going to work. Because let's say you succeed at the thing you're trying to do and you take their life. Did you win? No, because you took away from them something that they already said you can take away from me. If the person kills you, did they win? No, because the thing that challenged them was not your life. The thing that challenged them was precisely your affirmation that you are not your life. You are not defined by your life. That nothing that happens to your life matters to you. So they said, look, something happened to your life. You can say, yeah, it's not a big deal, right? So what happens when you meet another person is you are challenged by another absolute abstraction. But the only means you have of interacting with it is by grappling with these objective things in the world that they've already defined themselves as superseding, and the same goes the other way. So how are you going to expose yourself as the one and only one? You're going to have to risk your life and try to take theirs, and that's what the other person is going to do too. But that strategy is going to fail in principle to bring about the result that you want. You're never going to be able to prove that you are the one and only one, which was your thesis, because the thing you're using for proof has already been shown by the logic of the other person's attitude and by your own not to be sufficient to prove the thing you want to prove. So you can see then how the logic of defining yourself as a self simply through absolute abstraction does show that self-consciousness is not reducible to self-consciousness. It's not reducible to life. But it does not show that you are the only self-consciousness. You can, in fact, through that natural world, be involved in relationships with other self-conscious beings. Those relationships are defined in terms that are never going to be reducible to the terms that can operate simply at the level of life and objectivity. So another way of saying that, kind of the jumping ahead, is the logic of subjectivity or the logic of intersubjectivity is going to demand a logic of its own, right? So in a way, that's what you're discovering here. You're discovering the domain of encountering other subjects, and you're seeing the limitations that the most primitive logic by which you can recognize a self, the limitations that that logic would face in grappling with the terms of subjectivity as such, or shared subjectivity. So in other words, the initial terms in which subjectivity appears and can be defined, can be defined, are not sufficient. They may be necessary, but they're not sufficient to grasping the reality of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. So when I was talking about 186, I was jumping ahead a little bit to things that come up later. In 187, he says the presentation, the exposure to the other, is a twofold action. Insofar as it is the action of the other, each seeks the death of the other, but in doing so, action on its own part is involved. It has to stake its own life. So it's just in 187, he's just sort of playing out that stuff I already said. And later on, he says, it's only through staking one's life that freedom is won. I'm not going to bother looking up to see if freedom is. I will look and see if freedom is the term he uses. You can't really trust Miller. I'm having trouble finding this. Oh yeah, Freiheit. So I just say freedom. So that's interesting. I'll have to come back and look at that at some point. Anyway, only thus is it proved that for self-consciousness, its essential being is not just being, not the immediate form in which it appears, not its submergence in the expanse of life, but rather that there is nothing present in it which could not be regarded as a vanishing moment, that it is only pure being for self. The individual who has not risked his life has not attained the recognition of an independent self-consciousness. Anyway, so 180, paragraph 186 was just setting up the terms of that encounter. 187 is pulling out that idea about the need to stake your life and so on. And then 188 is about why struggling to death is going to fail. It's what you have to do if you operate on those basic terms, and in so doing, you're going to see that those basic terms are insufficient. 188, this trial by death, however, does away with the truth that was supposed to issue from it. You thought that if you killed him, that was going to confirm your certainty. The truth was going to be that you are the one and only. But it does away with the truth that was supposed to issue from it. For just as life is the natural setting of consciousness, which is where life is independence without absolute negativity, so death is just the natural negation of consciousness, negation without independence. So that it doesn't have the required significance of recognizing. So in other words, what you needed was for that. So the thing that challenged you was not the other person's life. The thing that challenged you was the other person's self-consciousness. The thing that challenged you was the other person's assertion that my life is nothing, your life is nothing, my desire is everything. So when you took the other person's life, you didn't eliminate the thing that challenged you. What challenged you was that other person's assertion of their absolutely unique centrality. So now you can ask yourself, well, what would it take to win? Killing the other person doesn't mean winning. What would it take? Well, you'd need to overcome the thing that challenged you. The thing that challenged you was that other's assertion. So the only thing that would actually win would be for that other to assert, oh, I was saying you were nothing, but I'm wrong. You're something. Actually, that's not going to be enough. To confirm what you had, the other person would have to say, oh, I thought you were nothing, but actually you're everything. And the only thing that would go along with that would be them saying, oh, I thought I was everything, but I'm nothing. Right? So in entering into the realm of self-consciousness, we're entering into the realm of the free subjectivity that gives that kind of meaning to things by the way it interprets it, by the way it desires it, by the way it takes it up, right? We're entering into the realms of perspectives. So it's the other person's perspective that challenged you. And so the only thing that's going to solve that challenge is a change in that other person's perspective. And the relevant terms of your opposition is each one saying, I'm everything, you're nothing. So the only way that your assertion that I'm everything, you're nothing could be confirmed is if the other one says, you're right, I'm nothing, you're everything. That's the point roughly of 188. Now, I'm just going to make 2 points there, and then that's going to be the end. 2 quick points. I've tried to show, following what Hegel's saying here, why that's sort of the logical form this takes. And that's what would count as success. The first point I want to make is, but you can already see why that couldn't work. Because the other person could say I'm nothing and you're everything, but that's actually nonsense because the other isn't nothing. So the only thing that would work to affirm your sense that you are everything would be if the other could confirm that for you. But in principle, that's not possible because the other can't both affirm that they are nothing and be nothing, right? Because just in affirming that they're nothing, they are continuing to demonstrate that their perspective, to the extent that you need that, they're continuing to demonstrate that their perspective carries weight and carries essential weight for you. So the very fact that you need them to affirm their nothingness means they would simply be wrong if they said, you're everything and I'm nothing. And that means you must be wrong when you say you're everything and they're nothing. That was the first point. The second point is, nonetheless, people can act as if those affirmations can be made, just like they can try to struggle to the death. And that then is what Hegel looks at next. He says, well, what happens if the other person does say, I'm nothing and you're everything, and you think, hey, I won. It didn't work to kill the other person, but it does work when the other person says, I'm your slave. That's what we're going to look at next time. So I'm gonna end it there. I'll just say a couple of words, but then I'm going to end it. So what I was trying to do here was first to remind you a little bit of where we were with Kant, and to try to connect, loosely the kinds of things I was saying in the last lecture about Kant on freedom in relationship to natural causality with some of the issues that we're going to talk about here. And I hope, you can go back and listen to that again, I hope the things that I've now said sort of positively about how freedom is enacted and how we experience it in ourselves and in others and so on, I hope those things go back and illuminate the sort of issues that Kant was talking about more negatively in the explanation of the Third Antinomy. And what we've been doing here is giving a bit of a phenomenology of the experience of freedom, experience of our own freedom, the freedom of others. Freedom here in the most primitive sense we can imagine. We're aiming for the most immediate version in which that appears. Just as in the science of logic, we're looking at the most immediate way in which reality appears. That's the first thing I was doing. Then I again, trying to talk about freedom a little bit, I tried to talk a little bit about how freedom comes up in Hegel's logic and gave you a quick look at what kind of book it is. Tried to talk a little bit about history and freedom. And then I wanted to zero in on the experience of freedom. And that's what we've really been doing here on. So we've been continuing with the phenomenological theme by looking at a little bit of describing the form our lived experience takes. Initially with the experience of desire, and then especially what happens when in the attitude of desire, we have an experience of someone else operating with the attitude of desire. Desire not as a relative stance, not desire subordinated to some other more basic form of self-identification, but desire absolutely. And I've tried to show them by talking through the 3 paragraphs of Hegel's analysis of what he calls the struggle to the death. I've tried to show why the simple stance of desire is insufficient to realize and recognize the very nature of self-consciousness and so on. We're going to talk about that more, and the more we talk about it, the clearer it will all be, and so on. Next time we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the next thing Hegel talks about, which is the relationship he calls Herr and Knecht, which would commonly translate master and slave, lord and bondsman. There were various other ways, and you know, there's some issues about how to translate it, and they're worth talking about, though I'm not going to talk about them because I really want to, whatever name he gave it, I really just want to talk about the phenomenology involved there, which is the description of the experiences of other people and the particular situation he's talking about. So it's relevant to empirical situations of slavery of various sorts, and we may talk about that. But what I'm really after, as I said before, is the phenomenological account of our self-experience and our experience of others. So that's what we'll come back to. So and then we'll take it from there. Okay, see you next time.